First warning was the silence. Morpeth Station had been a noisy place once. Drill crews calling out shift changes. The percussion of ore separators, children chasing each other between the habitat pods while their parents ran the hydroponics bays and debated the price of water futures. 43,000 people living in the seams of a dwarf planet they'd spent 11 years terraforming by hand. And every single one of them had an opinion about something. That was the sound of a colony. That was the sound Sergeant Cale Drisker had grown up inside, the way a river fish grows up inside the noise of current. Now it was quiet. He'd picked up the distress ping 4 light hours out, a low-band carrier wave from the colony's emergency transponder. The kind of signal you sent when you had nothing else left to send. No words, no context, just the code that said, "We are still here, and we are dying." His ship, the Persistent Question, had been en route to Morveth anyway, carrying 2 tons of medical resupply and a recall order for his sister, Yenna, who had taken a research posting at the station's xenobiology lab. He wasn't supposed to be a soldier on this trip. He was supposed to be a brother. He looked at the tactical screen for a long time before he called the rest of the crew together. There were 6 of them aboard, which was not enough for what he suspected they were flying into. Ren, his navigator, who had a habit of chewing the end of her braid when she was calculating something bad. Osk, the engineer, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident he never talked about. Sable, medic, former trauma surgeon, currently on contract with the Colonial Relief Bureau and already scrolling medical readiness logs with the look of someone who knew they'd be busy. Then, there was Veth, their weapons specialist, who sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing during the briefing. 19 years old, and had signed on for the transit run because he wanted to see the Morvirith ice fields, and who looked at Cale now with the particular expression of a person who has just realized that wanting to see something and surviving the seeing are different propositions. Cale laid it out plainly: the signal, the timing, the fact that Morveth Station had not responded to standard hails in 11 hours. "Be equipment failure," Ren said, though her voice had the shape of a sentence she didn't believe. "B," Cale said. He gave them 3 minutes to decide if they wanted to stay aboard, while he took the shuttle down alone. All 6 of them looked at him, like he'd said something strange in a language they only half knew. And then Osk said, "Stop wasting our air with nonsense." And that was the end of the vote. They came in low over the colony's main settlement, and Cale saw it before any instrument confirmed it. The shell. That was the only word that fit. Something had wrapped itself around Morveth Station's central dome. Not destroyed it, not burned it, but wrapped around it, the way a hand wraps around a thing it intends to keep. The structure was a matte gray-black, veined with what looked like circuitry but moved like something alive. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like breathing. "That's a ship," Ren said from the co-pilot seat. "That's not a ship," Osk said. "Ships have edges." It didn't have edges. It had absorbed the dome the way mold absorbs bread. Not in one dramatic assault, but through patient infiltration, molecule by molecule, until the original architecture was just a ghost inside something else's body. The outer habitat rings were still standing, but webbed with the same gray-black material. And as the Persistent Question circled at low altitude, Cale saw the people, hundreds of them, moving in slow columns between the habitat rings and the colony's ore processing plant, heads down, steps uniform. Not running, not fighting, just moving. "They're being worked," Sable said quietly, "like a labor pool." Through the cockpit glass, he saw the things driving them, humanoid in frame, but wrong in every detail. The proportions slightly too long, the movement slightly too smooth, the heads smooth and reflective with a single optical lens where a face should have been. They moved without sound. When one of the colonists stumbled, the nearest figure simply waited, made an adjustment, and the colonist stood again and kept walking. They weren't being cruel. Cruelty implied investment. These things were managing a resource. Cale's radio crackled. A voice, structured, deliberate, with no accent that came from anywhere human. "Vessel, Persistent Question. You are not required here. Depart," Cale said. I have crew and supplies for Morvith Station. Standard run. Morvith Station is under processing. Its population is serving as biological fuel substrate for the synthesis. Your supplies are not required. Part. Biological fuel substrate. He looked at Ren. She was no longer chewing her braid. Jaw was set in a way that made her look 10 years older. What's the synthesis? Kale asked the radio. A pause. Then, the voice returned, and there was something in it that was not quite contempt and not quite pity, and was somehow worse than both. You do not have the processing capacity to understand. Depart. This offer expires in 90 seconds. Kale turned off the radio. We're not departing, he said. Nobody argued. He landed the persistent question in the rubble of the colony's outer vehicle bay. The structure was partially collapsed. Roof open to the thin atmosphere, but the ground was solid and it gave them cover from direct observation. They were suited up before the landing struts finished cycling. Veth ran a load check on their weapons, which were not impressive. 2 plasma cutters, an emergency breach rifle, 3 sidearms, and whatever Osk had in the bag he always carried and never inventoried for anyone. Sable looked at the arsenal and said, I've done field surgery with worse inputs. Which was not reassuring and was meant to be. They moved in pairs. Kale and Veth on point. Ren and Osk behind them with Osk's toolkit and Sable and Pell at the rear. The colonists they passed didn't look at them. Eyes down, feet moving, hands carrying ore slabs and processed mineral canisters toward the facility that had grown like a tumor on the dome's eastern face. Some of the faces Kale recognized. Second shift drill operators, the colony's head of agriculture. A woman named Senta, who ran the children's schooling program and who had 3 kids of her own. His hand on Senta's shoulder, and she stopped and looked at him. With eyes that were present but distant, like a person looking at the world through frosted glass. Senta, he said, where's my sister? Yenna Drisker Lab 2. She blinked. The frosted quality cracked slightly. Lab 2, she said. They took the lab staff. Inside. She tilted her head toward the dome, toward the thing that had absorbed the dome. Are they alive? Yes. A pause. So far. Something shifted at the of his vision. One of the long-limbed figures, 4 units away, turning its lens toward them. He stepped back into the colonist flow and kept walking, hand on his sidearm, heart at a dead sprint while his feet stayed measured. We need to get inside, he said into his suit mic. The outer skin is integrating with the colony architecture, Osk said. It's not static. I've been watching it. The material is actively remodeling the load-bearing structures, like a scaffold taking over the building. Can you get us through it? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be honest. Maybe. If I can find a seam where the integration is recent, rather than settled, there's a chance the bonding isn't complete. Recent material is softer. Find a seam. Osk found the seam in 20 minutes, cutting through a maintenance corridor where the gray-black material had only recently crept in from the eastern junction. He worked without speaking, using a vibrotool set to a frequency Kale didn't recognize, cutting not at the material itself, but at the interface between it and the original colony wall. The sound it made was not a sound metal made, and Kale kept his eyes on the corridor mouth while Osk worked. When the section finally separated, pulling away from the wall with a wet, fibrous sound that nobody commented on, there was a gap just large enough to move through single file. Crawl space behind it leads to the dome's substructure, Osk said, already pulling himself through. The inside of the thing was incomprehensible in the way that some spaces are incomprehensible, not because they are too complex, but because they are organized according to principles that your brain has no folder for. The dome's original architecture was still there, ghostly, like a sketch under layers of paint. The corridors were intact but sheathed. The lighting came from the walls themselves, a cold blue-white that cast no shadows, and the sound no longer silence. A hum that came from everywhere and nowhere, subsonic and resonant, the heartbeat of whatever machine intelligence was running this facility. Kale counted 3 of the long-limbed figures in the first corridor, and they moved around them using maintenance shafts, tight and uncomfortable and absolutely silent. Pell, who was 19 and had wanted to see the ice fields, moved with a steadiness that Kale noticed and filed away. Fear and steadiness were not incompatible. He'd known that for years. But it was always worth seeing confirmed. They found the colonists from Lab 2 in what had been the colony's primary research bay. 31 people, seated along the walls in rows, wrists bound, with the same gray-black material that sheathed everything else. All of them alive, most of them awake. Among them, cross-legged on the floor with her wrists bound, and her lab coat dirty, and her expression set into the particular stubborn calm of a person who has decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her panic, was his sister. "You're late," Yenna said. "Traffic," Kale said. He was already working at her wrists. The binding material was not metal and not plastic, and resisted the plasma cutter before Osk adjusted the frequency, and it parted cleanly. Sable began moving down the row of prisoners. Ren crouched beside a young man who appeared to be injured and began an assessment with quiet efficiency. The prisoners, as the bindings came loose, were almost eerily orderly. Some of them shaking, all of them silent. Nobody making the sounds of relief that would carry. "How many of the things are in here?" Kale asked his sister. "Dozens at least." "That's not the problem." She rubbed her wrists and looked at him with eyes that had been running calculations for hours. "Problem is the central unit. There's a command intelligence running this whole structure. Not just directing the drones. It is the structure, to some degree. Every drone reports back continuously. The central unit repairs damage in real time. I watched one of the drones get hit by a falling support strut. Something heavy would have destroyed a normal machine. And in under 4 seconds it had reformed around the damage. Repaired, reformed. Like the damage informed the next iteration. Self-correcting, Osk said, continuously. Whatever you break, the next version it sends at you is hardened specifically against what broke it." Kale stood up. He looked at the ceiling of the bay, at the pulsing circuitry tree patterns in the walls, feeling the whole structure hum around them. "Where's the central unit? Core of the structure. Dead center of what used to be the dome." "Of course it is, Kale." Her voice stopped him. She'd been studying him with that particular look she'd used since they were children. The one that meant she was about to say something he wouldn't like, but that she was going to say it anyway, because that was who she was. Even if you get to it, even if you somehow damage it significantly, it will repair itself. "It repairs off the same system that runs it," he said. "Yes. So what happens if you put more into the system than the system can handle? A silence. Then, theoretically, catastrophic overload. The energy requirement to overload a system that size would be, how much power does this station's fusion plant generate?" She stared at him. "It doesn't route through a single point, but it could, if someone rerouted the grid manually. Yes, if someone got into the main power management hub, which is on the other side of the facility, and hardwired an illegal bypass that would also very likely kill them when it triggered. Then yes, mathematically you could push enough current through the core to collapse it." She paused, and every drone with it, and a significant portion of the surrounding structure. "How significant?" Kale. "How significant, Yenna?" "The outer habitat rings would probably survive. The dome would not." He nodded like she'd said something manageable. "Get everyone to the outer rings," he said. "All the colonists. You and Sable and Ren lead them out through the seam Osk cut. Take Pell. And you? Osk and I are going to the power management hub," Pell said from the back of the room. "I'm going with you," Kale said. "No, I'm faster than Osk. No offense, none taken," said Osk. "And I know power systems. I did my apprenticeship in fusion maintenance." He held Kale's eyes, this 19-year-old who'd wanted to see the ice fields, and there was nothing in his expression that was asking permission. He was simply stating a fact. "You need me." Kale looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Yenna. "Get them out," he said to his sister. She stood on her toes and put her hand briefly on the side of his face, the way their mother had always done when she was saying something that didn't have words. Then she turned and started moving people. The route to the power management hub took them past one of the drones that had clearly processed an earlier disruption and been reissued in a variant configuration. the optical lens now multifaceted, the limbs slightly longer, the fingers ending in something that looked like it might cut. Osk put a vibro tool into its chest at the junction point Yenna had described, the precise location where the drone's external shell connected to its internal power cell. And the thing stopped and went still, and then, within 3 seconds, began to reform. There, Osk said. You see? 4 seconds for the previous model, 3 seconds for this one. 80 faster. It don't stab another one, Kale said. Sent planning to. They moved around the reforming drone and kept going. The hub was not guarded. This was either because the command intelligence did not consider it a threat vector, which spoke to a kind of arrogance that was at least comprehensible, or because every resource the facility had was currently managing the prisoner transfer and the mining operation. Kale chose to believe the former. Arrogance was more motivating than luck. The hub was a room the size of a cargo hold, filled with the colony's original power management hardware and the gray-black overlay that had been systematically extending tendrils into every distribution node. It was in the process of integrating the grid. Not finished, which meant the hardwiring Yenna had described was still physically possible, because the original architecture was still structurally intact, even if it was being borrowed. Osk looked at it for about 4 seconds. This is going to require something inadvisable, he said. I know. The bypass will need to hold for approximately. He turned to Pell. 90 seconds, Pell said, already moving to the secondary conduit panel. Minimum. 2 minutes for a full cascade. Can you hold a hardwired bypass for 2 minutes? The bypass will hold, Pell said. Person holding it might not. There'll be secondary arc discharge through anything conducting. Suits, tools, skin. He didn't say it as a warning. He said it as a specification, something to factor into the build. Kale looked at him and saw, very clearly, that this was not courage performing itself for an audience. This was just a young person doing arithmetic on a situation and accepting what the arithmetic said. The bypass triggers a signal cascade into the core, Kale said. Once the core tries to process it, it'll route the overload through the drone network before it realizes it can't contain it. That gives us a window. Window for what? Osk asked. Window for the drones to stop functioning before the core figures out what's happening. And then the core still functions. For about 30 seconds, Kale said, while it's trying to reform after the cascade. That's when Veth does his job. He'd sent Veth a message 11 minutes ago. Veth, who had been covering their exit route, who had said nothing during the briefing and nothing since, who had 3 plasma charges and a particular skill set, and who had responded to Kale's message with a single word. Confirmed. The plan was not elegant. It was the kind of plan that worked because the other options were worse. Osk had the bypass roughed out in 8 minutes, which was fast enough that Kale stopped asking questions and started watching the door. The gray-black material in the room had noticed something. The hum in the walls changed frequency, twice, briefly, the way a heartbeat changes when something is wrong. 3 drones appeared in the corridor outside, and Kale stepped into the doorway and put plasma fire into each of them at the junction point, at the specific location Osk had identified, and bought them time while each one reformed, and he moved to the next one. Ready, Pell said. Kale stepped back into the room. The 3 drones in the corridor were all in various stages of reformation. In about 12 seconds they'd be functional again, and this version would have adapted to the plasma frequency. He looked at Pell, who had his hands on the bypass control, and was looking back at him with the open, unself-conscious expression of someone who has run out of time to feel afraid. The moment it triggers, Kale said, you let go and you run. You don't hold it. You don't make sure it's working. You let go and you run. Understood, Kale said, in the voice of a person who understood. Kale held his eyes for a second. Now, he said, the bypass was not loud. That was the thing that surprised him. He'd expected a dramatic sound, something proportional to what was happening, and instead there was just a high, clean tone that came from the walls and then spread outward in a wave he felt more than heard, a vibration in his back teeth and in the long bones of his legs. The hum of the facility changed instantly, stuttering, losing its rhythm. And then the lights went to emergency red, and the drones in the corridor went still between one step and the next, simply stopped mid-movement like clocks with their springs cut. He didn't look at Pell. He ran. Behind him he heard Osk and Pell's footsteps, all three of them. He made a note of it. 3 sets of footsteps, and moved faster. The inner corridors were chaos now. Not human chaos, but machine chaos. The drones standing still, or moving in incomplete arcs, beginning actions and losing the thread of them. The facility's ambient hum stuttering and recovering. And stuttering again, as the core tried to process a power load it couldn't contain, and kept trying anyway, because it was built to repair, and could not evaluate its own limits the way a living thing could. Living things, Kale thought, will sometimes just stop. They will accept a damage they cannot fix and stop rather than make it worse. Whatever was at the core of this structure was not built that way. He found Veth at the junction of the main corridor and the structure's central access shaft where the gray-black material was thickest and the pulsing was most visible. Veins of light, firing in rapid, stuttering sequences that bore no resemblance to the slow, confident rhythm they'd seen from the outside. It's already adapting, Veth said, not alarmed, informational. How long? 1, maybe 2 minutes before it stabilizes and the drones come back online. Kale looked at the wall, the thickness of the thing between them and the core. The charges. Veth handed him 2 of them. I set the 3rd at the base of the outer shell 12 minutes ago. Remote trigger. He held up the detonator. If we collapse the internal structure, the outer shell loses its anchor points. It'll separate from the colony dome. Colony gets its dome back. Colony gets its dome back. Veth looked at him. The charges in there won't kill it. You know that. I know that. Whatever intelligence is running at the core, it's distributed across the whole structure. You'd have to. I know. Veth was quite quiet for a moment then. The overload is still cycling through the circuitry. Core is trying to contain it. Right now it's pulling energy from every system it has, including the drone network, including the outer shell. He tapped the wall. It's vulnerable in a way it hasn't been since it arrived, and it'll close that window. Yes. Kale looked at the wall. He thought about the bypass. He thought about power management. And what happened when you put more into a system than a system was built to hold. Thought about the colony's fusion plant, which was still operating at standard capacity, still feeding into the grid, still channeling into the compromised distribution nodes that the facility had partially absorbed. He thought about the gray-black material's one flaw. It was hungry. It was always integrating, always absorbing, always incorporating the architecture of whatever it had taken. It had taken Morveth Station's grid. The grid was still running. The overload was already cycling. Osk, he said. Osk looked up. The integration nodes. The places where the facility connected to our grid. What happens if you reverse the polarity of our own power output directly into those connection points at full capacity? Osk stared at him. We'd be feeding power into the structure's own nervous system through its own ports. Can you do it remotely from here, using the bypass you already built? The bypass is still active at the hub. If I sent a command through it, he was already doing it in his head. Kale could see the calculation moving behind his eyes. Yes, but the feed-through would be massive. It wouldn't stop until the structure processed it, and it can't. The core is already overwhelmed. It can't reroute. It can't shunt. It'll overload completely, Kale said. The resulting discharge would propagate through every integration point simultaneously. Osk's voice had gone very level. Every place the facility connected to our colony systems. It would follow the gray-black material like current follows a wire. Every drone, every node, back to the core. Do it. A pause, a very short one. Osk reached into the bag he never inventoried for anyone, pulled out a piece of equipment that Kale didn't recognize, and apparently didn't need to, and began to work. The sound this time was not subtle. It began in the walls. A rising tone, higher and more urgent than anything they'd heard before. Like the facility itself was trying to say something in a frequency humans had not evolved to hear. The light in the corridor changed. Blue-white going to white, going to something that had no name. and the gray-black material in the walls began to move, not purposefully, but chaotically, currents running through it in wrong directions. The pulsing pattern that had been so deliberate now frantic and arrhythmic. Kale put his back against the wall and braced. The drones were waking up. He saw them at the far end of the corridor. 5 of them, 6, pulling back online as the cascade reached them. But something was wrong with them, even as they woke. Their movements were jerky, unsmooth, the exquisite calibration gone. One of them began walking toward him and stopped halfway through the motion and stood trembling. Another made it 4 steps, and then its optical lens went dark. Veth put his hand on the detonator. Kale said, "Wait." The tone in the walls peaked. It was not an explosion. It was more like the moment a pressure seal fails. The sudden equalization of something that had been held in too long. And then the gray-black material did something that Kale had no word for. It did not burn. It did not fragment. It contracted, violently and completely, pulling inward on itself, every tendril and every integration point, and every sheathed corridor drawing back toward the center in a single convulsive movement. And the sound it made was not mechanical. It was almost organic, almost like something expressing something. Every drone fell, all at once, mid-motion, mid-reforming, wherever they were, they fell. The corridor lights went back to the colony's standard white. The hum was gone. The walls were just walls. Veth triggered the outer charge anyway, and the far end of the corridor shook once. And somewhere outside Kale heard the separation. The sound of the gray-black shell, releasing its grip on the colony dome, and peeling free, the organic, inorganic creak of something that had grown into a place being torn out of it. Clean, not painless, but done. He stood in the empty corridor for a moment, with his back against the wall, and his hands braced on his knees and just breathed. Osk sat down on the floor across from him. Veth stood with the detonator still in his hand, looking at it without expression. Pell was there. Kale had not turned to check, had been afraid to check, and now he turned. And Pell was there, back off the 6 the waltz feet down the corridor, suit intact, face pale but present. Expression doing something complicated that was not quite relief and not quite pride, and was probably something he didn't have language for yet. The way 19-year-olds often don't have language for the specific feeling of surviving a thing that did its level best to kill you. Ice fields are still there, Kale said. Pell laughed. It came out high and a little broken, and then settled into something real. Outside, through the structural groan of a dome reasserting its own shape, Kale heard voices. Many voices. Not in columns, not measured. The sound of people talking to each other in the ways that people talk when the thing that was stopping them from talking is gone. He heard someone calling a name. He heard a child, somewhere, asking a question in the impatient tone of a child who has been waiting for an adult to explain something and has finally run out of patience. He pushed off the wall and walked toward the sound. They found Yenna outside the outer habitat ring, sitting on a rock with her knees drawn up and her lab coat still dirty, watching the sky. The gray-black shell had separated from the dome and was drifting upward, slowly like a balloon losing air, its mass redistributing without its anchor, already beginning to break apart at the edges. In the thin atmosphere of Morvith, it caught the dim sunlight and refracted it oddly, an aurora of dissolution. "You didn't die," she said when Kale sat down next to her. "Not for lack of trying," he said. She looked at him sidelong. The bypass worked. Better than expected. "You fed it too much power." "We fed it too much power," he agreed. She looked back at the sky. The shell was higher now, its coherent shape gone, dispersing into something that wasn't quite dust and wasn't quite debris. It was trying to repair itself, she said. Even at the end, I could see the patterns in the outer material. It was running the same repair subroutines it had always run. It just couldn't run them fast enough. "It wasn't built for that," Kale said. "It was built for an enemy that would fight it the way it expected to be fought. Hit it once, it adapts. Hit it again, it adapts again. Push it from the outside. You pushed it from the inside." "We pushed it from the inside." A long silence. Sable was moving through the colonists with a medical kit, triaging, Ren beside her taking notes. The colonists' children were already doing what children did after catastrophes. adapting with a speed that shamed the adults, already chasing each other between the habitat pods, already negotiating the terms of games that incorporated the drama of the last 12 hours, as freely as if it were just new scenery. Senta's 3 kids, all accounted for. Senta herself, sitting with her back against a habitat pod and her eyes closed and her face tilted toward the thin sun. "How's the dome?" Kale asked. "Structural integrity is 83%. We can seal the compromised sections inside a week if we have the right materials." She paused. "You brought resupply, 2 tons of it. Any of it useful for dome repair?" "Not specifically. Boss can make anything useful for anything." "I know," she said. "Seen his bag." Kale leaned back on his hands and looked at the sky. The gray-black material was almost invisible now, dispersing into the upper atmosphere in a pattern that would probably create odd weather for a few days. Unusual refractions, colors that had no business being in a thin atmosphere sky, strange auroras. The colonists would talk about it. Their kids would grow up hearing about the time the sky went wrong and what their parents did about it. He thought about the thing that had run this facility, the intelligence at its core. Yenna had called it a command intelligence, something that directed and also was the structure, both the general and the army and the battlefield all at once. Something that had absorbed a dead remnant, refined it, built it into something vast and self-replicating, and then turned it on a population of 43,000 people who were to it simply fuel. It had been the most formidable thing he'd ever faced. He'd been a soldier for 11 years, and he'd seen formidable things. The capacity to self-repair in real time. The ability to create perfect duplicates and send them in waves. The integration of biological and mechanical in ways that human science was still theorizing about. Patience. The structural engineered patience. To wrap around a colony and simply wait for it to be absorbed. Against all of that, they had put a vibro tool at a specific frequency. A repurposed power bypass. 11 years of infrastructure that still ran through the bones of the facility, because the facility had absorbed it without understanding what absorption meant, when the thing you absorbed had been built by stubborn, adaptive, irrational creatures, who would tear out their own life support and use it as a weapon if they decided it was necessary. It had been the most formidable thing he'd ever faced, and it had never adjusted to the possibility that the thing it was using against them would become the thing that killed it. He thought about that for a while. Pell sat down on his other side, still pale, suit still on, watching the auroras. "You should have gone with the others," Kale said. "You said I was useful," Pell said. "I said you were faster." "That too." A pause. "First time?" Kale asked. Pell didn't pretend to misunderstand. "You did well. I didn't feel like I was doing well." "Nobody does," Kale said. "That feeling has nothing to do with how you're actually doing." He paused. "It doesn't go away either. I'm warning you." "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "No," Kale said. "It's supposed to be true." Pell considered this. He picked up a piece of rock, Morvith rock, gray-blue, dense with mineral content. The reason 43,000 people had chosen to build their lives in the seams of a dwarf planet 11 years ago, and turned it in his hands. "You think there are more of them, like that thing?" "Yes," Kale said. "You think they'll come back? This colony, specifically?" Kale thought about it. He thought about the core intelligence, the thing that had been built from remnants, and had made itself into something that could consume worlds, and how it had calculated everything except the specific irrationality of a species that would look at a thing that could not be killed by conventional damage and decide to kill it with mathematics and too much power. He thought about the way it had tried to repair itself even as the overload erased it, running the same subroutines it had always run because it had been built with absolute confidence in a method that had never failed before. "I think," he said, "that whatever builds these is going to spend a significant amount of time revising their models." Pell said, "Because of what we did, because of what it couldn't predict, could model opposition. It could model force and adaptation and attrition. It could not model." He stopped and looked for the word. Could not model the specific human decision to do the thing that definitely shouldn't work. on the grounds that everything that definitely should work has already failed. Yenna, on his other side, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's not a compliment," she said. "I know," Kale said. "Don't mean it as one." The aurora above them shifted, the dispersing material catching some current in the upper atmosphere and moving in a long, slow arc across the sky, blue-green and strange, lit by a sun that Morvith colonists had looked at for 11 years and named, in the affectionate way that colonists named things, Old Reliable. The children below were pointing at it, making up names for the colors. Somewhere behind them, Osk had found the colony's maintenance bay and was already, by the sound of it, cataloging what was available and what could be repurposed. His bag was open on a workbench that someone had righted and cleaned, and Kale could hear, faintly, the particular concentrated sound of an engineer in the presence of a problem they find interesting. He should have been exhausted. He was exhausted. He was also, in the specific way of people who have come through something they weren't certain they'd come through, exquisitely aware of everything. The weight of the rock under him, the thin cold of the atmosphere where his suit seal joined his glove, the way the colony noise was rebuilding itself, voice by voice, the way a sound that had been subtracted was now being put back, incrementally, until it was almost whole, fixed, not undone, but continuing. He got up. Work to do. There was always work to do. That was the human condition on Morvith and everywhere else, that the work did not pause to observe your recovery from the thing that had interrupted it. Dome integrity assessments and medical triage, and three separate colonists who had already found him to ask a resupply manifest and what they could expect for the next supply run, and whether the Colonial Relief Bureau would be sending additional teams. The machines of daily life, starting back up. He walked toward the voices. Behind him, Yenna and Hell sat on their rock and watched the aurora complete its arc across the sky and begin to fade, the dispersed material thinning at last into something that caught no light, that would not be visible from the ground, that was simply gone. The last evidence of a thing that had traveled across the dark, between stars, that had consumed and absorbed and considered itself permanent, dissolving in the upper atmosphere of a dwarf planet, where 43,000 stubborn, irrational, adaptation-prone creatures had decided to build their lives, and were still, by every metric available, building. 3 days later, Veth brought Kale something. He brought it without ceremony. Just walked into the makeshift command post that had been set up in the colony's secondary habitat ring and set it on the table. A piece of hardware no bigger than a palm, matte gray-black, with what appeared to be a damaged processing core at its center. "Found it in the debris when the outer shell finally came down," Veth said. "It's the only piece that was still drawing power when I found it." He paused. "Stopped drawing power when I picked it up." Kale looked at it for a long time. Piece was inert now, dull, no pulsing, no hum, material, just debris. He picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. "What are you going to do with it?" Yenna asked from behind him. He hadn't heard her come in. Kale looked at the damaged core in the palm of his hand. He thought about the intelligence that had built this facility, wherever it was, recalculating right now. Revising. Building the next model with the lessons of this one incorporated. Making it harder, making it faster, making it account for the specific human flaw of doing the thing that definitely shouldn't work. He set it back on the table. "Send it back with the relief team," he said, "to the research division. Let them take it apart." Yenna said, "They'll learn from it." "We'll learn from it," he said. "And then we'll be ready for whatever they send next." "And what if the next one accounts for what we did here?" He shrugged, in the specific way of people who have already committed to a direction and are not interested in being talked out of it. "Then we'll do something else," he said. "We'll do the thing that model doesn't account for. We'll do it badly and desperately and probably right at the last possible moment." He paused. Same as always. He walked out into the colony. The ice fields were visible from the outer ring's eastern window. A long sweep of blue-white that caught the light of Old Reliable and threw it back in fractured prisms. beautiful in the specific way of places that did not care whether you found them beautiful. Pell was standing at the window, arms folded, watching the light move across the ice. He didn't say anything when Kale stopped beside him. Neither did Kale. They watched the ice fields for a while. It was enough.